Oh,
let's
okay.
then begin.
Because I have another talk then in the evening.
Oh God, okay.
Okay. So it's a great pleasure to finally have with us Ulf Brunnbauer from the University of Regensburg in Bavaria. He's also the academic director of the Leibniz Institute for Eastern and Southeastern European Studies. And he has, Professor Brunnbauer has graduated from the University of Graz, where he also completed his doctoral thesis. And he completed his habilitation in the Freie University of Berlin, and then of course he was elected professor in the University of Regensburg. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. We were hoping to have you in flesh and bones, but this is good enough, and we're going to have a rendezvous sometime next year. Professor Brunnbauer has studied the mountainous societies and the family structures in the Rhodope Mountains. He has also studied everyday life, if I understand correctly, the title in Socialist Bulgaria. And he has edited the Routledge Guide to Southeastern European Studies. And it's a pleasure to have him with us this afternoon. He will give us a lecture on stories from the can, what oil sardines can tell us about class and politics in the Adriatic since the 19th century. Ulf, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Socrates. Thank you so much also to Galina and Nikos for having me without having me. So we really tried hard, and I think we tried very hard not to do it remotely, but at the end it was the only opportunity. But I would definitely prefer to be in Crete. The title of my talk is a little bit grandstanding, so it promises much more than I can actually deliver, because if you managed to listen to our small talk before the talk, what I'm going to tell you is more or less a small story, which I think has the potential to be scaled up. And I would really appreciate all your feedback, because what I'm going to present is very much work in progress. It's in the intermediate results of a case study that I could do on one of these canneries in the Adriatic. It started more as a hobby, as a side project, because I must admit I really love sardines. I eat them in all kinds of forms, fresh or canned. As you also gathered from Socrates' introduction, I started my academic career by studying mountain societies in the Balkans. And as happens so often, people from the mountains at some point migrate to the sea. And so after all, I also ended up on sea level. I'm now doing this project on fish, and especially the industrial preservation of fish. I'm also going to share my presentation, just a second, so that at least you have a couple of nice pictures. I would have brought sardines from this factory which I'm studying, and I'm currently almost looking on it, because I'm sitting in Istria right now for another project that I'm doing on another maritime industry, shipbuilding, which is basically my main project and the more serious one. But then in connection with the shipbuilding industry, I got interested in the fish canning industry. And I want to start with two quotes from the case study that I'm going to present in detail, which is located in Istria, which is nowadays part of Croatia, in the small and scenic town of Rovinj. So the first quote is from a publication of this factory from around 1990, which praises the production of the Mirna cannery. The secret of the Adriatic sardine is not yet fully scientifically explained. The secret refers to the special delicacy and extraordinary taste of the sardine from the clear Adriatic Sea, which differentiates her from similar fish caught in other seas and oceans. The fact is that the Adriatic sardine is more gentle and of better taste than those from the ocean. So there seems to be a certain pride in the what in Croatia is called the small blue fish, the mala plava riba, and obviously the best sardine comes from the Adriatic, according to these people. A second quote from an interview that I did with a skilled worker at the Mirna factory, where I did some research, archival research, also a little bit of oral history. And these are just excerpts from a longer interview, but which already show, I think, the richness of the history that can be told on the example of a relatively small, though locally important factory in this very peculiar industry, which is the canning of fish. So some of the things that struck me, for example, the problem started in the 1990s when the dolphins came. We had so many dolphins, problems with the dolphins. So that was a problem for the local fishermen, how to prevent fishing dolphins, catching dolphins as bycatch. He also spoke about the places where the products, the fish cans, went in the 1970s and 80s, when this was still in socialist Yugoslavia, Iraq, Kuwait, also the army as an important purchaser of their product. We had been trained in a different system. We were more Western educated because we were sometime before that under Venetian rule, and then we were under the Austria for 180 years, and so on. So this is also very topical for local narratives presenting Istria and Eastern societies more civilized, more cultured than the rest of Croatia, because they were under Austrian and Venetian rule. And they often reflect about nature. And something else I want to tell you, these big weather changes. If you heard about that 3 or 4 years ago, this was terrible here. Because of a temperature difference of 2-3 degrees, fish appeared that had never been seen here. You know, there was white yuga. Yuga is a southern wind, the wind coming from the south, which blows lightly during the day and strong in the evening and warm. And this was the death to the fishes. So without going into the details of this interview, I think what it does show is not only richness of history, but also a clear attempt to locate this small factory on what people are doing in larger narratives, and also an acute awareness that the interrelations, the interactions between humans and the environment, the sea in this case, do matter. There is no history of the canned sardine, neither in Croatia nor the Adriatic, which is in a way a pity, because it used to be an important industry. There's some research about, pretty much research about Portugal, where the sardine is really a national product and where the canning of fish used to be economically very important. Also about the French coast, especially the Bretagne, which is where all this started. So the first fish canneries appeared in the 1830s in the Bretagne. But very little about the Mediterranean apart from some local histories, which is in a way sad, because you could tell a global history of the sardine, of the canned sardine. So many of you probably have already encountered the history of the sardine if you ever read John Steinbeck. So one of the most famous books of John Steinbeck, of course, he produced very many famous books, is Cannery Row, which takes place in the town of Monterey, which is a town south of San Francisco in California. And in the interwar period, also the early 20th century, Monterey was something like the global capital of the sardine. where massive amounts of sardines were landed and then transformed into canned sardines on a large industrial scale. And Cannery Row takes place there, and it starts, I don't need to read it, but here you have the opening sentences of the book. It starts with the description of a very colorful local community, which is shaped by also the rhythm of the fish and the production of sardines, drawing all kinds of people, marginal people, what you would expect in an industry or in a town dominated by fishing, by sailors, and by seasonal workers being employed in a very marginal industry that didn't pay a lot. There's also a second prolongation, by the way, Sweet Thursday by Steinbeck, also taking the action in Monterey over 1945. So two excellent books where the sardine in a way is important. There's one great study on sardine canning, which is by an American environmental historian, Connie Cheng, also in California. She wrote a wonderful book, which in a way serves as a reference also for what I'm trying to do, other than I have like the literary abilities of this author, but also the sources. She had wonderful historical sources for her story. And this is a book called Shaping the Shoreline, which is in a way which presents the canned sardine, the sardine can, as if you would like to use Marxian terms, as the congealed relations of class, race, immigration, gender, local politics, also national politics, and the environment. Everything goes into the can, or the other way around. You can tell something about these major relations, these major processes from the perspective of the work, the production, but also the consumption of the canned sardine. It's a book about fishing technologies and how the technology of fishing is also related to race, which obviously is paramount for any US-American context, showing, for example, how inventors tried to invent machines that would make the employment of Chinese, which was the immigration problem in California at that time, the employment of Chinese workers unnecessary. So racism producing technological innovation, for example, on the example of machines used to cut and clean fish. And it is a book about the competition between the fish industry and tourism, because Monterey very early developed into a very fancy tourist resort for the American upper class of the late 19th century. And again, obviously, race is an important part of this competition as well. The local fishermen were Chinese, Asian, Italian, and the tourists obviously were white. Really a book that illustrates how on a very mundane product like the canned sardine, you can say something about the most important processes shaping an American society. And it is a book about the environment. It's a book about overfishing, about the inability of humans to accept the very fact that that fish stocks can be overfished, and how long it took well into the 1960s that despite all evidence, people just did not want to accept the reality that their way of fishing would impact a resource which they thought would be unlimited, but at the end appeared not unlimited, but rather disappeared. So it's also a book about deindustrialization, because after World War I, these many fish canneries that existed in Monterey and that produced for all of America and also the world market disappeared because the sardine had disappeared. Together with colleagues in Ljubljana, we tried to do something similar, but on a much more modest scale. But it is a beginning. So if you read Slovenian or Croatian, because it also exists in Croatian translation, this book, Zgodbe iz konserve, Stories from the Can, which is a collection of essays, some of like research essays, but also essays from practitioners, people who have memories about the fish canning industry in the Upper Adriatic, and showcasing also the richness of this history and its importance also for local memories, because very often, as I will show, this industry exists only as memory, but not as an industry anymore. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today. So I want to speak a little bit about economic history, because I gathered from Nikos that the seminar is very much about economic history. I want to speak about the people who are producing canned fish, which is mainly women. And at the end, I plan to say a few words about the environment, although I obviously don't understand much because I'm not a scientist. And I developed my arguments on the case of a fish cannery in the town of Rovinj. So if you're not so familiar with the history and operations geography, here you see the location of Rovinj, which shall be important, the place where it is located. It's a small town, a couple of thousand inhabitants nowadays, living basically only from tourism, although this cannery still exists as one of the very few Adriatic canneries that actually survive. This enterprise, this firm, Myrna in Rovinj, was established under a different name in 1924. It was called Ampilea then, because in the interwar period, Istria belonged to Italy, but there had been canneries even before the first cannery in this town appeared in 1881. So when I started to do this hobby, this side project, I always kind of struggled to make it relevant. I mean, not every interesting story is relevant per se. This is where I really depend also on your feedback. But I do think one argument could be made that this story is relevant because the fish canning industry used to be really economically important for coastal regions along the Adriatic, in Dalmatia, in Istria, also on the Italian side of the Adriatic, and also in other parts of the Mediterranean, and then obviously especially on the Atlantic coast of Portugal, Spain, and France. So I think if you study economic change, social change, the emergence of industries in coastal regions that used to be marginalized, peripheral, relatively poor, or very poor. Dalmatia, for example, was the poorest province of Austria until as long as it was Austrian. So then you in a way cannot bypass this industry because it was important for these localities. And the sardine is also a global product. So I think you can also in a way relate it to the history of globalization. This is a quote from a German small book on the European sardine, the Sardina pilchardus, published in Eastern Germany, by the way, interestingly enough, saying that sardines in oil are among the best known fish products in the world. There's hardly any other fish product with such stable international popularity. And then just pointing out that wherever you go in the deepest bush in the jungle, you would in a shop you would invariably find also a can of sardines. When zooming in on the economic history of the Upper Adriatic, Istria, Dalmatia, then it is evident that in many places fish canneries were the first industries, the first factories where people, especially women, had a chance for wage employment. It's also interesting or an important industry because it shows how important capital from Austria, from Vienna, from Prague, also from Trieste was for the industrial development. Development is probably too much to be said for these mini industrial developments along the Adriatic coast. One of the most famous investors, for example, was a guy called Karl Wachanek, who was born in Bohemia in 1829. So according to Shakespeare, Bohemia is also on the sea, but usually you would consider it not a very maritime country. He developed a huge fish canning network of factories reaching from Trieste down to the southern Dalmatian islands, also producing canned fish in Vienna. He was official purveyor of the imperial court in Vienna, and his factories, at least under his name, existed until recently in Vienna. Also in Bohemia, there are also fish canning enterprises in Bohemia, in the Czech Republic. Going back to these developments, and this is when in the 1880s, 1890s, fish canning became an important industry along the Adriatic coast, especially the coastline, which nowadays belongs to Slovenia and Croatia, starting with Trieste as the major also port, and then going down. Very often small factories in very isolated places. And this is also a global story, by the way. So I did a little bit of reading about the canned salmon industry, and you would find salmon canneries in Alaska at God-forsaken places where nobody lived, but you had a factory. And then always, of course, the important question is where you find your workers. What is interesting from a local point of view for the history and local historian, which I also am, Istria belonged to Italy in the interwar period, and after World War I came to Yugoslavia. It was a very contested process, but eventually in 1947, the Allied countries decided to give Istria to Yugoslavia, or to accept Yugoslav control, and which is also interesting for these industries, because already in the interwar period and also before, when they were established, these industries, they catered for not for the local market. They produced for an international market, and they also depended on international supply chains. For example, they got the tin for the cans from somewhere else, from Germany, for example. They got fish from other countries because local catches were not enough for production. So you actually see international supply chains, and they become suddenly disrupted in 1947 with the Iron Curtain. And so the factory that the firm that I am studying, they're then struggling to rebuild these connections, which now run across the Iron Curtain, because they depend on olive oil, on tomato from Italy for their products, and they depend on the Western market because they used to produce for the Western country, what was now Western Europe. Well, the Yugoslavs, they didn't eat fish much, so the domestic market was not very large. After World War II, when Istria came to Yugoslavia, Istria experienced an industrialization process like many other parts of Yugoslavia. Before that, it was really very rural, within Italy, marginalized province. Now a deliberate effort to build up industries. And this is when small factories like this fish canning factory in Rovinj gain more importance locally, but also regionally, receiving investment from the government to build up, to buy new machinery. And I mean, this is probably then something not so interesting for a general audience. But what you can show on this example are some typical features of the socialist economy. Yugoslavia, as we all know, was a very idiosyncratic socialist country, but socialist it was after all. And its political economy displayed some of the typical features of socialist economies. And those features are, for example, that we are talking about economies of shortage, and we are talking about economies where supply chains were always difficult to manage, because you could never be sure whether your supplier would deliver the products in the necessary quality, to the necessary amount, and on time. So there was an inbuilt tendency in socialist economies that enterprises tried to integrate as much as possible under one roof within one enterprise. And you see that on the case of this small cannery. They started as a small cannery that depended on products like tin, packaging, and so on, fish from other enterprises, from other firms, which became in a way unviable under socialism. So they started to integrate as much as they could within their own enterprise and building really what I called in an article a small empire of fish. They built up their own fishing fleet. They purchased thousands of fishing boats, had their own fishing fleet. They bought a shipyard so they could build and repair their own fishing ships. They began to produce tin cans. They did their own packaging. They had their own transportation system, so their own logistics. So they just didn't want to depend on service providers. They also broadened their production portfolio from canned sardines and canned mackerel and anchovies to clams, to beverages, to alcohol, to canned vegetables. They started also to farm fish. So they were among the first, if not the first in Croatia in the 1970s to farm fish, mainly, I don't know in English, sea bass and dorada. Probably in Greek, it's probably the same. It's generic. So also clams. So you really see a small empire, and in the 1980s they employed more than 2,000 people, which was pretty many for a small town like that. So it's also a very typical story for socialism. Here you can see, for example, it's a very scenic, by the way, it's a fjord in Istria, the Limski Canal, very scenic, where up to this day they farm oysters, mussels, and also fish. So they pioneered fish farming, which for some time was also seen as environmentally more, in a way, sensible. But nowadays, obviously, we also know all the negative side effects for the environment from fish farming. And they exported to all of the world. So like 80–90% of the production usually went abroad, also during socialism. And the most important markets were Western European countries and also in the United States. So you do see that actually there was some pressure from below, from individual enterprises, which also pushed the national government to open up, to connect with the wider world, because they depended economically on international trade, and they wanted to trade with countries where they could earn hard currency and not with socialist countries where they would earn money for which there was no real use. Very broad, even infamous fish burgers, so some convenience food also being produced. Then indeed, here just to throw in some numbers, so what you do see is during socialism, like a huge expansion of production, also of fishing, and then a sudden decline in the 1990s when Croatia became independent, when the Yugoslav economy and then the Croatian economy basically collapsed, and then of course Croatia also being in war, which did not directly affect Istria, but obviously the years of war from 1991 to 1995 were not very conducive for economic reform or for attracting foreign investment. In the post-socialist, and then this is a general story all around the world, that the climax of the fish canning industry in Europe and in North America has long passed. Now the center of gravitation is in countries like Morocco, Thailand, Peru, where labor is much cheaper as long as you have fish. Fish canning disappeared totally from the US, for example. The last canning factory in Maine closed a couple of years ago. In Canada, there's one remaining. And also in Croatia, only very few of them survived. Incidentally, some of the oldest one actually. So it seems that having a tradition in a way helped to survive deindustrialization. And what then is also would be an interesting story typical story of post-socialist corrupt privatization. So 10 years ago, this firm in Wien was basically bankrupt, and it survived only by that, only just, and then actually experienced a kind of renaissance over the last years, because the largest Croatian food conglomerate, the Podravka concern, bought Mirna and also invested in new machinery, so that capacity was expanded. They nowadays can produce 50 million cans of fish every year. They wanted to introduce a second shift, and then another interesting thing happened. They didn't find workers locally, so they wanted to recruit 3 years ago like 120 additional workers for introducing a second shift, but it was absolutely impossible to find anyone locally for this kind of job, which pays well below the Croatian average net salary. So they had to begin to find people in the poorer parts of Croatia, Eastern Croatia, towards Serbia and Hungary, which is very underdeveloped, and also bringing immigrants from Bosnia into a country which usually is very loath to accept immigrants. And what this says is, what this shows is that there's huge competition between tourism and industry for not only the use of the shoreline of the coast, which is also a big topic for local debate, because this factory occupies a very nice place directly at the seaside, and until recently they used to let all the ovals, all the everything what they didn't do, just uncleaned into the sea, which didn't smell very nicely. But there's a competition for labor, and tourism pays much better, obviously, although it's not a very popular way of work, but it pays much better. So it has become very difficult to find cheap labor for this kind of job. And what you see in places in Croatia, but on a more global scale in America, for example, where plants were relocated from North America to South America, in Croatia or in the Adriatic, some fish canneries were relocated from the coast to inland locations, like, for example, from the Croatian Dalmatian island of Postira to Niš in Serbia, 200 kilometers away from the seaside. And nowadays in Pula, right now, sometimes you see lorries, this refrigerator with a Niš registration plate, waiting for the landing of sardines and then bringing them to this factory in Serbia, where labor is very cheap because there's not much else where people can find work. Okay, a second dimension which makes this small story relevant is actually who worked in these factories. And if you would want to formulate the first law of fish canning, then it is usually all around the world at all times, it is women occupying the shop floor of these canneries. And this is also one of the only theme basically which attracted more interest by research. So at least in America, there are a couple of studies about female labor, very often also female migrant labor in the canning industry. Just a few pictures to illustrate this point, taken randomly from different centers of the canned sardine, from Slovenia to California to the Basque Country, Morocco, Portugal. You always see the shop floor being occupied by women, which has several reasons. One of the reasons was that initially this was a seasonal industry before fish could be deep frozen. It was the rhythm of production was dependent on the seasonal catch of sardines, so labor was employed, which did not have to be employed all year around. Very often people still having one foot in farming and the other one, or the males being fishermen and women then working in these factories. But generally it was about finding cheap labor. And it was also obviously also rationalized, which is also something that I found in my documents, that the sardine is such a delicate fish. So I found one nice report from the 1950s where the director said, sardine is such a delicate fish, so we need women with the long fingernails because only they can clean them. What is interesting in the factory that I studied, Mirna, where like 90% of the workforce was female. Interestingly, but not very surprisingly, the director was always male. The few engineers working there were also male, but the ordinary workers, they were all women. Well, I found there a photo album with pictures from the 1970s showing life in the enterprise. And what is really striking, well, first of all, obviously a lot of women, but what you do see, I mean, it's probably taking this a little bit too far. It's just a few pictures in not regular work situations, but at ceremonies or training events, other kinds of irregular events. But what these women I find transpire is a certain degree of self-esteem, of self-respect, which you maybe would not expect from an industry where working conditions were very hard. You had to work in a very cold environment. It was loud, pretty dangerous, and of course the odor was not the most pleasant one. And fish ovals smelled in socialism not better than in capitalism. But you still see, and we did interviews with former workers of these factories, and what we do see is a high degree of identification with this kind of work during socialism, because it was one of the few chances for some sort of upward mobility for their own wage for women in regions that were hardly industrialized before socialism came. And what you also see is that, I mean, you can say a lot of negative things about the socialist economy for good reasons, but one thing what at least the Yugoslavs achieved was to organize a high degree of respect and recognition for unskilled manual labor. This is what people really remember. They remember the factory as a community, and remember a very high degree of social coherence built around this factory, built around the sardine. The Mirna factory even had the Miss Sardelle competition every year, where one of the employees could win the trophy Miss Sardelle, and I don't know whether this was something you will really want to gain as a prize, but you got the dance with the director of the factory, the Miss Sardelle. Finally, a few words about the environment, which probably would be the most interesting part of the story, but also for me as a modest historian, most complicated thing to research, because understanding this literature by scientists on fish is really very hard for a non-scientist. But this is what the sardine and then also the fishing and the fish processing industry based on the sardine can tell us about the environment and about interactions between humans and the sea. So first of all, the sardine is a very volatile and very capricious fish. It's not only relatively small, but it can sardine stocks can disappear and reappear for reasons that are not well understood. Some of these reasons are man or human induced, although I think it's fair to speak about men in this case, because fishermen are men usually most of the time. But some of the factors which make sardines appear or disappear are probably not the direct result of fishing, for example, or of pollution. So it's a very, very complex story. The Adriatic is also a complex sea. It's relatively small, as you all know, relatively closed. The Strait of Otranto is like 100 kilometers only between Italy and Albania. And it has a very interesting stream pattern. So on the on the eastern side, on the Dalmatian coast, you have an upward stream bringing warm and salty waters from the main Mediterranean basin to the north. And on the western coast, along the Italian coast, you have a southern stream, a southward stream, bringing water which is colder, also with more oxygen and less salty because of the large rivers, especially the Po, that water into the Adriatic. And the Po brings water from the Alps. Some of the time fresh water, some of the time very polluted. Even historically, it was a very polluted river. And it also brings a lot of sediments into the sea. So basically a natural process, but sometimes also amplified because of the fertilizing of the Po runs through some of the most intensely farmed regions of Italy with a lot of fertilizers. So this changes the water quality in the Adriatic substantially. And for spawning, the sardine depends on a very small range of water temperature and also only a small range of salinity. So if temperature changes beyond this range, too cold or too warm, or salinity level change, the sardine would just disappear and spawn somewhere else, and you don't have sardines. And here in such a relatively closed sea like the Adriatic, you of course do see then the impact of humans. For example, when the Po is polluted, you do see the consequences for the fish. So I don't speak about, it's also interesting topic per se, the kind of nets that are used. What is interesting, it shows the volatility of the fish. While there is overfishing, it does not directly affect the biomass in the Adriatic because fish might move from somewhere else to the Adriatic and leave for other reasons than fishing. What is important for my story is that the 1980s were the best time of sardine fishing in the Adriatic, which was very helpful for my case study, the Mirna factory, because Yugoslavia at that time was in a deep economic crisis and everything was going down basically, with the exception of the fishing industry, because they could catch so much sardines and they could produce so many canned sardines, which they used for export and to earn foreign currency. So in a way, nature helped them to survive the difficult 1980s, which for many other businesses in Yugoslavia meant the end. So some tables here showing this climax of landings of sardines in the Adriatic in the 1980s. The reasons are not very well understood as far as I understand from the science literature that I went through. But what we do know that in general, the biomass of economically relevant fish, which does not include only sardines, but also other pelagic fish in the Adriatic, it is decreasing for also man-made reasons. And one of the most obvious reasons is the increase in water temperature. Nowadays, so it's probably not a very bold projection that in a few decades there won't be any sardines, at least not to an economically relevant degree in the Adriatic, because the water is simply getting too warm. But they are replaced by other fish. So just want to remind you of the quote from the interview. The water in the Adriatic gets warmer. Other fish that were not typical for these waters enter, and typical fish like sardines leave. Nowadays, you would find sardines in the North Sea, in the northern North Sea actually. So now there are substantial catches up to Scotland, for example, and the Scottish Islands, which is a result of the warming sea. So again, this very small fish and the industries built around it are in a way also a seismograph for how coastal communities will be affected by climate change. And so at the end, for these different reasons, the disappearing sardine at some point, then also the difficult place of industry, of classical factories in very touristic regions, and then what would be specific for my case study, the travails of post-socialist economic transition, which very many industrial enterprises just did not survive. It could lead to a situation where the industry of fish canning, which was so important in the Adriatic in the late 19th and also throughout the 20th century, would turn just into memory. And at some places it has already been the case, like for example on the Croatian island of Brač, where you would find this nice monument which hosted a large sardine factory, or also the small town of Bagnoli near Pula, where the sardine factory disappeared and was replaced by a huge and very ugly hotel. Very few of these producers survive, and the best example is certainly, well, the best examples would be in Europe, would be Portugal and France, where there's a deliberate effort to, in a way, upgrade or upmarket the sardines. So wherever you go in France, especially the coastal regions, you have these shops with a lot of wonderfully designed canned sardines. And Portugal is also excelling in producing these high-class sardines, which are relatively costly. The Mirna factory, which I studied, they at least try to frame their product as the superfood. Superhrana is Jadrana, the superfood from the Adriatic, and also saying that a can of sardine contains twice as much vitamin D as eggs. And I think that's it. Yeah, just to show you some of the nice sides of doing research on fish canning. This was the food that was presented at the cantina, at the cafeteria of the Mirna factory when I did my interviews there. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now you can ask questions or say what you think. You can always raise your hand by using the participants in the banner in the bottom of your screen, and raise your hands and I will see it. It's in the participants button. So otherwise, just raise your hands if I can see it. Thank you very much, Ulf.
Έχω σηκώσει εγώ το χέρι μου.
Yes, Jelena, you are right. You're the first one. Yes, go on, please.
Okay. Now, thank you all for this fascinating story. I love what was the name? I did not know about the, what is this, in Monterey? The Cannery Row, okay, in Steinbeck, yeah. I love that, and back to the Adriatic. Now, these are stories we do not know, and thank you very much for this. And within also the political environment and within the sea. I have many questions, but I will say a few. It is also in Greece, we had, from shipping and fishing to tourism as well, which is another story, which is very interesting. One question is, you answered it at the end, that where did they fish? Okay, so was it just in the Adriatic? Was it also farmed fish? I'm not sure you can farm sardines, but I'm ignorant. And the other thing is, do we know any other? I mean, I do know that there were factories. I think so in Italy of canned fish. I mean, how much do we know about canned fish in the Mediterranean? Okay, and would you have a map, or would you make comparisons with other sardine areas in the Mediterranean? So that's just to start.
Yeah, thank you, Kelina, for this excellent question. To start with the second one, I don't know yet. So obviously there was canning of fish, especially sardines, also tuna, mackerel in Italy, southern Italy mostly. Sicily was an important place. Also some of the small Italian islands. I do know of some local stories. There are also some local efforts to musealize these stories, because most of this really has become memory. This industry is largely disappeared. But there's, to my knowledge, not really research about that, and there's no comprehensive literature. We don't have a map. This is something that actually I am now starting to do. So I just employed a student helper who knows Portuguese, who knows Spanish, to get what information there is about fish canning in Portugal, Spain, also France, where it was hugely important, and Italy. So I'm also curious about the geography. What I do understand from what I know already is that there have been interesting processes of relocation of this industry, which was also related to the availability of sardines. So it started in the Bretagne, then for reasons that I don't know, fish became scarce in the Bretagne in the course of the 19th century. So French capital moved to the Basque country, both sides of the border, which became an important producer of canned sardines. And then they moved to Portugal, which up to this day is very important. And then the next step was to Morocco, which now is one of the most important worldwide producers of canned sardines. So most of the canned sardines in an ordinary European supermarket would probably come from Morocco. They usually have a nice Italian-sounding name. But if you look where it is produced, which is also due, by the way, thanks to a free trade agreement between the European Union and Morocco that was signed a couple of years ago. So you do see how important also this international trade relations are. But there's no comprehensive study, and I would really want to produce a map. We did this now for Croatia, Slovenia, but not for the rest of the Mediterranean. So I'm looking forward to the results of the research of my student assistant. Where did the fish come from? Not only from the Adriatic, that would not be enough. So a lot of the fish that is used for production, which also helped to make this a year-round industry, is frozen fish caught in the Pacific or caught somewhere else in the Mediterranean. So especially Portuguese fishing fleet has been providing also Adriatic producers in the second half of the 20th century, with also Turkish fishing fleet, which...
so this is ocean going as well, Indian or Pacific?
It's also, there's a Pacific sardine, there's an Indian sardine, and some of these supplies, so what this initial quote that showed that the Adriatic sardine is of a special delicacy, which might be true. It's really a very, very tasteful fish if you get it fresh, but you get it fresh only a couple of weeks in the year. So for the rest of the year, they depend on frozen fish wherever it comes from. And I think that in a can, you probably would not taste the difference between a Pacific sardine and the Mediterranean one. Although the Pacific sardine pretty much disappeared in the 1980s. So this is one of these phenomena when, for reasons we don't exactly know why, these stocks which fed a huge Japanese, a huge Peruvian, a huge Chilean fish industry disappeared more or less overnight.
Okay.
Thank you. Nikos Megapanos. Nico?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Extremely interesting. Being a Mediterranean myself, I think it's very important that you complete and present the whole story of the sardine. It's a staple, as you know, in particularly for working class. Used to be, it's so. The one question I have was, you talked a little bit about the production. What about demand? I mean, are there nations that consume more than others? Is there a preference in the taste, or I don't know, some specific points of interest there? And the second question is, when you were answering Jelena about the production moving south from France to Portugal and then to the coast of Africa, doesn't this seem counterintuitive? I mean, it's moving south where the water is warmer, whereas the complaints in the Adriatic is that it's disappearing because the waters are getting warmer. So do we have any clues on that debate at all, or on that sort of question?
Well,
thank you.
Thanks. These are two excellent questions. Again, to start with the second one. First of all, the fish that is used in Morocco does not necessarily come from Moroccan waters. And we also should not forget that the Atlantic is pretty cold. So the fish, the provision of fish is very much globalized. But the thing is, or the advantage of Morocco is to have a huge pool of cheap labor.
Cheap labor, yes.
And then obviously, thanks to their free trade agreement with the European Union, they can export the things without tariff. So this again shows how globalization works even in these mundane staples that don't, or maybe especially because it doesn't take you a lot of technology and investment to produce them on a large scale. The first question is excellent. I don't really know much. I mean, I know about where the Mirna factory that I studied, where they exported, these were mainly Austria, Germany, Belgium, and also the United States, but I don't know who consumed it. I do know, I found only one study, there might be more, on the consumption of canned sardines, which was done by the US, I don't know, the Federal Department for
Agriculture,
and something. And in the 1960s, because they were worried about the decline of the canning industry in the US, and they wanted to understand how to stimulate consumer demand. And what they found out, and it's exactly what you probably also would have surmised, is that it was working class food, and it was especially Black Americans who ate canned sardines. Well, it was not really very popular among like middle class Americans, also because that was a time when fresh fish became easily available. What I also do know is that all around the world, armies are an important client of.
Obviously, because it's canned, and so it can survive.
It survives for ages. I mean, obviously, you have an expiration date on the can, but I think you would open it 20 years later, you can still perfectly eat it.
Thank you.
But I think when this is why I don't know so much about the success of Portugal, but they are producing these high-end cuisines, high-end cans, and also with all kinds of recipes for which you use not fresh sardines, but canned sardines, and it seems to be pretty successful, actually, and it has become a nice souvenir also to buy and to bring.
I use it with pasta, it's excellent.
Yeah, pasta with canned sardines and some zucchini, perfect. It's a great food and a lot of Parmigiano.
We can promise you fresh sardines in Crete, I'm sure. Colleagues down there.
Yeah, fresh.
Know the good outlets.
Definitely.
And they taste better than the Adriatic ones, okay?
Adriatic ones.
Dimitra Milona.
Hello. Thank you so much for this. for this trip to the sardine canneries. Actually, you caught me having just finished this, one of the books you showed us. So yes. I was very well tuned into this topic.
I'm sorry, Dimitra, I'm sorry to say this, but this is, you have in front of you the archaeologist of fish.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I'm an archaeologist of fish.
I'm just, yes. Exaggerating.
I have two questions. One is, you showed us sardine canning on an industrial scale. Was there at any point in this historical period you talked about, were there additionally smaller scale production units? And the second question is, we are talking here about one very specific type of product, the canned sardines in oil. Were there at the same time any other type of fish processing, like salting of sardines, for example?
Yeah, thank you. I finally a specialist. Probably we are the two only ones in Europe that ever read this book, but Beyond Cannery Row, which is an excellent book. So, Dimitra, thanks for these excellent questions. I think what I gather from the Dalmatian or this Adriatic experience, a lot of these factories, they grew out of traditions of producing salted fish on this more craftsman's like scale. But I didn't find evidence that once these factories were created, that they continued to also do this more small scale preservation of fish, mainly for private purposes, but not for marketing. But canned sardines were not the only fish. First of all, there were other fish canned as well: mackerel, tuna, also salted anchovies was and still is an important business because they are also obviously more expensive than sardines. And they also produced a lot of fish meal and fish oil, which was especially the fish meal, which is an important fertilizer. Which, by the way, is also very important. You might have read this in the book that you just showed. It was also very important for this industry in Monterey or in California. Actually, sometimes more important than the canned sardines was fish meal and fish oil produced as fertilizer for farming. And they had some that's a very curious side story, but this makes, when you find all these very interesting stories. In California, they began to implement some sort of environmental rules, also like limits on how many sardines a cannery can process per year relatively early, in the early 20th century. So there were already some concerns about overfishing. And then also the local population complained about the bad odor coming from these canneries. And there was some limits on fishing, but it all pertained only to the territorial waters of the United States. And at that time, territorial waters stretched out only, I think, 3 sea miles. And so there were some very imaginative producers who bought big ships, big old ships, transformed them into swimming factories, and then produced outside of the bounds of Californian jurisdiction, produced fish meat and fish oil on an industrial scale. So you always have this competition between state authorities trying to regulate this business in some way, and then very inventive fishermen or industrialists who come up with solutions which were not very good for the environment, but were good for their business and for their bottom line. And I think this is one of the also interesting aspects. You do see a lot of actually business innovation with constant catch play between state, government, and local economic interests.
Now that you talked about these constant innovations, and having mentioned Portugal, Portugal not only has a very long tradition in sardine canning, but they also have a very long historical relation to fish processing, because in Portugal, you can find some of the largest industrial scale, real industrial scale ancient processing plants, fish processing plants. And I hear that now Portugal plays a lot on this fishing cultural tradition. So what they do is that they want to revive the old traditions of garum producing, the fish sauce production, and they are in the process of duplicating and reviving one of the ancient fish processing plants, and they want to produce garum on an industrial scale, exactly the way they did it in the Roman times.
Interesting.
And of course, that's part of this whole story of using the past and using our heritage to add value to our current products.
Definitely. Fish is really very, very an important heritage used for all kinds of purposes in Portugal. Whether garum production on an industrial scale will be an important. When I use garum, but I don't know many other people who still use it and that trust only one small Italian producer. But we'll see. Good idea.
It's becoming fashionable.
Yeah,
chefs with Michelin stars, etc., produce their own garum these days.
Yeah. No, I mean, what is interesting about Portugal, which is why I do want to do this comparison, because you have now these memorialization processes and all kinds of touristic appropriations, and also this idea of the Portuguese sardines, so there's like a regional product, which is also interesting per se, how you can conceptualize a fish that moves beyond borders, obviously, in this very nationalized term. It's really the national fish. But it was also really very important economically for the modernization of Portugal. And if you look, there's some nice publications from the 1920s and 1930s, especially 1930s, when Portugal actually was a right-wing dictatorship. Salazar, the dictator, before that was Minister of Finance of Portugal, and he supported the fish canning industry a lot because it was so important. It was actually the only export industry in Portugal at that time. And if you look at least at the visual representation of these industries, it looks like from socialist countries in the 1950s. You have modern factories, women for the first time being employed, everything is clean, they are building housing for the workers, they are building schools for the workers, they are building kindergartens for the workers. So it's basically the same visual representation of modernization of rural places like you would find in socialism. So again, and this shows that these are these kind of stories in the European South that link the Iberian dictatorial or experience with the Southeast socialists. Two different types of developmental states, but in a way doing very similar things, although the ideology around it was very different.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ulf. Nikos?
It was very interesting, Ulf. I wonder if you plan to focus on the fishing communities, and moreover, if you believe that there are any similarities between these coastal, maritime, or fishing communities and the mountainous communities that you have started in your earlier research in Bulgaria, Rhodope. I mean, they usually do not have any substantial agricultural production, for instance, right? And inland. And so they used to send seasonal workers, perhaps, such as masons in other places. And all this that you have described in your book about globalizing Southeastern Europe. And if that is the case, I wonder how easy is it to create factories, to build factories in these places? And specifically, where are those factories founded? And kind of a second question, if there is a kind of a tradition of fish preservation, such as salted fish, perhaps can we see these women working in the canneries there is, I suppose, a traditional division of labor. Men go fishing and women prepare the fish. So we can think of was there a kind of a previous skill on which these women built, and was there any kind of a relationship between where the factories were created and where there was such a tradition and skilled labor?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, they thought to be unskilled, but I think there was a kind of skill in this labor, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Nikos. The first question is excellent. I have not thought about this comparison, but now when you are asking it, it is in a way, to some degree, strikingly similar, because you have these communities which cannot depend on farming because of local conditions. When you know how the Dalmatian coast looks like, there's not much what you can do in terms of farming beyond subsistence farming, and then maybe growing wine, which then was destroyed by the phylloxera. So you depend on auxiliary activities, which are market oriented. I think this is another similarity between what I found in my study on the Rhodope Mountains in the 19th century, that these mountain communities, because they could not depend only on farming because of reasons of environment, of nature, they depended on using resources outside of their communities, which also actually opened them up to the outside world. So they went as seasonal migrants, for example, somewhere else, or the female folk was employed in a proto-industrial cloth production in industry. So they produced for a market, they were integrated into markets much more than like ordinary peasant communities. And I think this is very similar in fishing communities, which did fishing not only to have something on their own table, but to sell. That might be a similarity. Actually, from the Rhodope Mountains, there are also some villages that specialized on fishing. So they came down to these lakes that used to exist near to Komotini and Thessaloniki before these lands were how do you call it, transformed into farming, and so they came from the mountains to do fishing in these coastal lakes. No, but there's, I think, yeah, and also the seasonality of work is also very, very, very similar. And also the clear in the mountains, it was the male population that went with sheep and goats, and females who did whatever little farming they did and producing cloth or weaving, and in the fishing communities, men being hunting the fish and women working in the small factories. The second question, that would also be my guess. I don't have a total match between like pre-industrial traditions of fish preservation and the location of factories, but from the anecdotal evidence that I have, I do see that there are certain traditions which are important. And then of course the question whether you can reach these places either through the railway, which was important for Trieste and these places, also Rouen, which was connected to the railway, or you can reach them easily by ship, and you have a natural harbor, because these produced not for the local market, so you had to find a way how to ship these products somewhere else, which was also important. So communication infrastructure plus pre-existing traditions of fish preservation. I think these are the main elements of this equation.
Thank you. And may I use my privilege as a host to ask a question as well? You talked about female migrant labor, seasonal questions of let's say immigrants who are somehow coming from another cultural environment. Do you have this kind of phenomenon in your case? I don't remember the name of the town, Rouen or something.
Rouen,
so,
yeah.
And the second question would be, well, looking at the location in the interwar period is a kind of dead end. Afterwards, Yugoslavia, it's close to Trieste and Venice. What happened when this region becomes Yugoslavian? When it looks now more to the east, let's say.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of transformation in the industry, in the organization, in the labor force, for instance?
Yes, excellent. Thanks, Socrates, for these two excellent questions, which are actually connected, at least in this area, they are connected, because when Istria came to Yugoslavia after World War II, and also some of the Dalmatian islands, they also used to belong to Italy, and now they also went to Yugoslav control. One of the immediate consequences was that a great deal, actually the majority of the Italian-speaking population left these places, and especially in towns like Rovinj, Italians were the majority. So at the beginning of Yugoslav control, there was, for example, nobody to fish, because most of the fishermen have been Italians. And it was also very difficult to recruit workers, because most of the local workforce were Italian women. And what now happened in the 40s was a process of immigration towards Istria and also the other coastal areas from the inland, but also from more distant parts of Yugoslavia. And what we could gather from the oral history that we did is that very often these were women who left their native place for different reasons, maybe also because of some more like individual problems, a lack of perspectives, and saw these new areas of Yugoslavia as a space of opportunity, where they could leave parental control. Yugoslavia, especially the inland, Bosnia, for example, where a lot of people from Bosnia moved to these new territories. These were very patriarchal regions, very rural, little industry, women under the full control of men. So there were very many good reasons why you would leave and even take a job in what maybe would seem as a not very attractive industry, but it opened new possibilities. This is what we see. So we do see immigrant women. Then the relations between the native population and these new immigrants not always being easy. Maybe these are people from very different areas of Yugoslavia, so from very different cultures, speaking a different dialect, sometimes a different language, sometimes having a different faith. So there are some local tensions. But generally, Yugoslav socialist enterprises were quite good to integrate, to socialize these very different, or these very diverse communities through self-management, which was important in this respect, and also through these many activities that were organized by the enterprise for the workers. So activities organizing also their leisure, providing places in holiday homes and so on. And so therefore these local enterprises played a very important role for integrating a population which in places like Rovinj was perfectly new after World War II, which makes it even more interesting, because this also then indicates some of the patterns how Yugoslavia created some sort of legitimacy in areas that it required only after 45.
Thank you, Ulf. Is there any other question?
I just wanted to say.
I will have to leave in 4 minutes. I beg your pardon. I apologize.
Just one, because he has to go to another lecture. The final word.
Yeah, I'm not going to say a question. I know that he has to leave in 2 minutes. Just wanted to ask, as Zalevizakis here, Nikos Zalevizakis, I just wanted you to introduce you to the PhD student. They're usually shy, the PhD students, that is doing
like the sardines, yeah.
Like the sardines, like he does history of fishing, and so he can come into contact with your research assistant, and he can tell you all the areas of Greece, you know, that have are known for their sardines, and keep them for ourselves. So,
please, Nikos, if you're still here, we don't see you, then just drop me an email. Would be very happy to establish contact with you.
Okay. Where is Nikos?
He's hiding somewhere. I have seen his name.
Yeah.
He's always there.
He's always there.
Maybe the other Nikos could provide the other Nikos with my email address.
Okay. Okay. Good.
Very well.
Yeah. All the students are you terrified them off, so they don't appear. But that's all right.
Thank you very much, Ulf. Let's say that next year we're expecting your Ethimnon somehow.
I would be so happy.
In one way or another.
Okay.
By boat from Regensburg.
Thanks for
taxi,
the hospitality
and to Ethimnon.
And the great questions. It was really super useful for me.
That's the idea. That's the idea. You also give us. It's also food for a future research project here.
Certainly food for thought. Yeah. Can't food for thought. Actually,
there's a lot of food for thought.
And also, food for thought. If I would have come, you would also have food for pasta with canned sardines.
Exactly. And in Greek, you know, it's sardella. So it would be Miss Sardella looks fine. It sounds fine.
I didn't know that. Yeah, in Croatian it's also sardella. Whereas in German, sardella is anchovy. So
yeah, it's sardella and sardeles. Is there a lot of sardella? So very, very nice to see you. Thank you very much for
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice evening. Enjoy your sardella.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Goodbye.